Okay, great. Um, so today I have Daniel Muñoz with me. He is absolutely brilliant philosopher. I think a rock star philosopher right now. Uh, just introduce yourself, Dan.
Well, thank you for that. The mini introduction note. So, I am a normative ethicist. I'm interested in questions about right and wrong action, good and bad outcomes, and good and bad character. In particular, I'm really drawn to moral paradoxes. The idea that in our common sense ideas, there might be some tensions that are subtle, but if you don't pay attention to them, you don't realize that they run deep. There's deep confusions that threaten very basic ideas, like the idea of a moral right, that I might have a right against you, that you not harm me for someone else's greater good. Ideas like supererogation, the terrible bajillion syllable word for going beyond the call of duty. It's the most obvious idea in the world that favors are optional, and that as nice as it would be for you to run into the burning building, it's not like you're obligated to. But the idea of not being obligated to do the best thing you could do seems very puzzling on reflection. So I'm drawn to these kinds of basic paradoxes, particularly in defending concepts like rights and supererogation from the opponent, sometimes known as the maximizing consequentialist, who thinks the ends always justify the means and nothing else does.
Yeah. So, when I think about like like your paper wronging oneself, right? Like I read that paper when I was I guess a moderate deontologist. It was such a beautiful paper, man. I mean, like seriously. Um, so one of the things that is one of the things that I found in your paper, like when you uh when you like say so you wrote that paper with I think
Yeah.
Nathaniel Baron Schmidt,
Yes.
right? So like this self-other symmetry, you use this concept of like self-other symmetry, right? Um, can you like explain that? Like if someone is just does not know what that is.
Definitely. So, a lot of philosophers believe that the self is morally special, right? So, you're allowed to keep your spare kidney rather than donate it to somebody who's on dialysis, who needs your kidney more than you do, because you can treat yourself as more important. They also believe that while the self can be more important, the self is also in a way less important. So you owe tons of obligations to every being more or less in existence, except for one. Many philosophers think yourself, because the idea of owing yourself something would be very silly. It's like I have to ask you for consent before I record our conversations, or before I tug on your hair or pinch your ear. But it'd be crazy to think that I have to consent to my own well, at least it seems crazy to say I have to consent to my own, recording of myself, or tugging on my own ear, or pulling on my own hair. I mean, maybe if I yank on my hair really hard, it's not smart, but it certainly seems like I'm not violating any rights or wronging myself. But I actually think that this view is paradoxical. Like, I think this view doesn't make much sense. Um, I mean, just one basic thought is that the two asymmetries I just mentioned seem to be completely the opposite. Like, you can keep your kidney because you're so very important to yourself. On the other hand, you can do, yank your hair, do whatever you want to yourself because morally you don't matter. I mean, there's no duties to self. Isn't that a little bit puzzling that, you're number one and also number zero when it comes to, well, number arbitrarily large when it comes to the to being owed duties. So that's an old argument from Michael Slope. But let me just the positive argument for the self-other symmetry, which I like a lot, is this. I want to understand why you don't need to ask for permission before you do things to yourself that you would need to ask for permission when you do them to someone else. And the answer, because the self is special, seems to me like barely any answer at all. Special how? Special why? Can you tell me something more? And here's what I think the something more is. What you do to yourself, you do to a consenting party, right? If you are intentionally harming yourself, like let's say you're smoking, okay? I wouldn't recommend that, but I don't think you're violating your own rights necessarily. Maybe we could argue about it, but it's not obvious to me that it's automatically a rights violation because look, who's the unwilling victim, right? It's like selling a cigarette or giving a cigarette to somebody who's offering money and who's validly consenting to the transaction. So that's the basic idea, is that if we want to really understand why the relation to self seems special, you should think of it by analogy with cooperative behavior. You're sort of like your own best consenting party. And if I could just use one more metaphor, this is from Joel Feinberg. I got this from Jordan McKenzie, and I can't get enough of it. Um, you're in an arranged marriage with yourself. So you better get along.
Yeah, great. I mean, like when I became a consequentialist, like this kind of stuff did not really bother me, I guess. I mean, like I think if you believe in rights, right, I think this kind of stuff, like it would bother you somewhat. Um, Especially like if you're like a libertarian, right? Um, because they seem to I don't know if you have read like some of the absolutist libertarians like Hans Hermann Hoppe, Murray Rothbard, and like these absolutists were like they believed that um, basically that the person can consent to like the person can consent to kill themselves for like pointless reasons, right? At least that's like their libertarian absolutism entails. Right. They also believed in like you should not violate property rights or commit aggression, even if you have to like save half of the world or something, right? So very absolutist, right? Very Kantian, I guess. But I think even Immanuel Kant believed in like duties to self based on self-respect, you know. Um, I think I read that from your Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy article, Obligations to Oneself. So such a beautiful article, man. How are you such a great writer?
Oh, thank you so much.
Yeah, yeah, because you know, um, like your paper, um, like I guess I don't know if you would feel good about this, but your paper helped me move toward consequential.
Not the intended effect, but as long as you're getting something out of it, I can't complain.
Yeah, no, I mean seriously. I mean, it's like Richard Chapel's bleeding heart consequentialism, right? I think Richard is another fantastic philosopher, like you. Um,
Yeah, I
so
think very highly of Richard.
yeah, yeah. I also see that you like liked his paper, Value Receptacles, you know.
Oh yeah. I think it's one of the most underrated papers of the
Yeah,
century.
yeah.
Um,
I mean, I agree with his paper, so I guess I want to ask you like what stops you from being like a consequentialist like Richard?
that's a great question. Um, I suppose I think how do we believe in any moral view in the first place? Usually there's some intuition. So for Richard, there's a bunch of intuitions of the form like, pleasure is good, pain is bad. Um, I certainly get that one, right? But I wouldn't say that that's more obviously right than, say, rape is wrong or murder is wrong. And I say that even in cases where, you know, you can come up with a thought experiment where the consequences of, let's say, murder, are very beneficial. You can steal someone's spare organs, no one will ever find out, save 5 lives with all the viscera that you end up with. This is the classic transplant case from Philippa Foot. And I just think that that's as obviously wrong as causing gratuitous pain. So that's my starting point. Is I'm just as drawn to the deontology as he is to the consequences. Um, but then, um, a lot of people get pushed towards consequentialism by the sense that deontology is like a paradoxical mess. And I think Richard does a nice job of showing some of the mess, but lots of others have done similar things. So how much of a mess is it? Well, part of why I want to do the self-other symmetry and argue for this view that your relation to yourself is like your relation to a consenting other is it lowers the total mess, right? It's bad enough that you've got all these complicated rights against other people. Um, I'm joking a little bit here because, but they certainly add complexity to the theory, right? You have to ask questions like, are rights absolute in strength, or could it ever be permissible to contravene a right for the sake of saving a life? Can I steal your medicine to save someone's life? If for you, you just like the taste of the medicine. For them, it's life or death. I think so, but now we have this complicated weighing that we're going to have to do between rights and consequences. So that's mess, but I think it's worth it. And to reduce the total amount of mess, if you just spot me that we have rights with certain weights, some of which are weaker than consequences, some of which are stronger, then I think you can derive a theory of how you should treat yourself because you wrong yourself when you do what would wrong even a consenting other, and you're fine when you do what would be fine to do to a consenting other. And then I also think you can derive a theory of supererogation. So when I choose to go beyond the call of duty, I think what I'm basically doing is waiving my rights. You know, um, you can't take my kidney from me unless I consent. Similarly, I think I don't have to hand it over unless I consent. But I don't literally give myself consent. What I do is I make a decision and I change who owns the kidney. So I'm very sympathetic to the consequentialists who want less mess, and I'm trying to I'm inspired by their progress to try to do some similar cleaning up in deontology. By the way, if you want to talk about Kant or the libertarians, you raised those issues earlier. They're very good too.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, yes. So, I mean, the reason I was pushed towards consequentialism is that you did reduce the mess in moderate deontology, right? You did reduce it. I think it was a successful work, but it was more like, okay, well, consequentialism already like has it solved, right? So, like, I thought about it like that, and like some of the recent objections to deontology, like from not just Richard Chapel, right? From Kasper Kowalczyk. I don't know if you know his name. Kasper Kowalczyk is another. Um, then there is, of course, Johann Gustafsson. I think Johann Gustafsson. I think that's his name. He has like build. He's a classical utilitarian. I was a classical utilitarian just like I guess a few months ago, few weeks ago, I guess. But then I just found Richard Chapel's Bleeding Heart Consequentialism to be ultimately more plausible. I guess because like I was dealing with like stuff like okay, like structures of like beauty. So like certain kind of beauty seems to be like just generates pleasure, right? And if I believe that beauty is like metaphysically good, like if I believe in like it necessarily produces pleasure, right? Okay, so how far away am I from like an objective list utilitarianism, right? Like because I think you also probably have heard of Neil Sinha Babu. I think he's uh, he's in Singapore. Another fantastic philosopher, right? He's a ethical hedonist, right? So, act utilitarian, classical act utilitarian, right? Um, he's not an intuitionist. He gives like more like a phenomenal introspection argument for like goodness of pleasure and badness of pain. So it was like multiple reasons pushing me toward consequentialism, right? It wasn't just, I guess, your paper, but your paper was like an additional piece in the evidential chip, I guess, that moved me toward consequentialism, you know. So I want to ask you, like, what do you think about like aggregation, right? This is the main thing about consequentialism, right? Aggregation. So, so to explain quickly, aggregation just means is less like, so Tim Scanlon, right? Like he gave this great example where you have this like Super Bowl going on or like some great football game or something, but one dude who is like in like this technical like tech support or something sector, he gets like electrocuted continuously, and to make sure that this dude does not suffer horrible shocks, or that can be lethal, right? He can really die. We have to stop the broadcast for at least a few minutes or like perhaps even hours, and that would like cause a lot of people disappointment, right? But that disappointment is minor, but the suffering that that dude is going through is intense, right? Really intense, and he could die, right? Utilitarians at a certain point would have to say that certain minor disappointments can add up such that the intense suffering of that dude can be overcome. So we should allow that dude to suffer those shocks. But a contractualist deontologist, or like basically, I think any moderate deontologist would, to an extent, would like say, no, right? No, like audiences, minor pleasure is not enough. Sorry, it is minor pleasure. Yeah, their minor pleasure is,
Exactly.
yeah, minor disappointment is not enough to like just let the dude suffer intensely or just die. So yeah, that's like utilitarians believe in aggregation, and deontologists are like not cool with that. They are not cool with just adding up the pain and pleasures in such a way that they aggregate to minor pains equal greater than like intense suffering, you know. So yeah, that's aggregation.
Yeah. So I've got a lot of thoughts on aggregation. I think that for a long time it's been a little bit unclear who the opponent of the aggregator is. So the aggregator thinks 10 deaths are worse than one death. Some number of headaches or, is worse than one person getting paralyzed. Some number of people missing 10 minutes of the World Cup is worse than Jones getting shocked in the transmitter room. But like, who disagrees exactly? And so, as you say, it could be the deontologist who disagrees, but it's not totally obvious to me that you have to believe in rights to believe that like the numbers don't count. You could just believe it's not better to save two lives of this kind than one life of this kind. Um, you know, uh, but and actually, what's interesting? Recent work by consequentialists, I think, has been bearing this out. So Jake Niebel has been arguing that, for example, you can be an old, in a sense, a total utilitarian who thinks all that matters is the total utility, while not believing in this kind of addition, as long as you are sort of subtle about what you think welfare is or pleasure is, right? So instead of thinking of it as a scalar quantity, where there's like, what is it, like pleasure points, as you will, hedons, and you can always add them up. Um, he says, think of welfare as like a vector quantity, right? So there's multiple dimensions of it. And then so there's a magnitude, but there's also a direction. So there's, how much of it is small fry soccer or football pleasure? How much of it is, oh my God, it burns, awful, intense pain? And you could have a view that, well, basically, instead of having a single line with like amounts of pleasure, you have a whole, like a two-dimensional space. And then you have a lot of freedom to say, well, which parts of the space count as having more pleasure or more pain? Um, it's an interesting mathematical exercise just to figure out like how many ridiculously many ways there are of ordering a vector space like this. So, um, So I haven't said anything about whether I believe in aggregation. I just wanted to point out that it's arguably a kind of in-house consequentialist debate that even deontologists, deontology might not save us from. Uh, so what's the status of the debate? I think it's totally unclear who wins. Totally unclear. I think there's a ton of arguments. Scanlon gives some arguments. Cam gives arguments. Johann Gustafsson gives arguments. I just find them systematically unconvincing. The arguments tend to go like this. Um, if you care about everybody equally, you'll care about the harm to the many more than the harm to the few, right? So can I give an example? So imagine that you've got Jones and Smith, okay? And you've got a pill you can use to save either Jones from dying or Smith from dying. If you care about them equally, it seems like either death would be equally bad, right? Just as good to save Jones as to save Smith. But now imagine that there's the Smiths. There's an extra Smith, um, a sibling or something, and you can split the drug and save both of them, or you can use the whole one to save Jones. Jones still needs a full dose. What Scanlon would say is, if it was already equally good or permissible equally to save Jones or Smith, and you add in a whole other person, that person should break the tie. Otherwise, you're saying that they make no difference, and you're saying that they don't count equally. You see what I mean? So that's why two has to be better than one. Now, it's a kind of interesting question why he doesn't apply this argument to to other cases of aggregation. But anyway, that's the argument. I think that this argument totally fails. It just completely fails. Like, it's just not true that if you value one as much as two, you must value the one person doubly. Right? That's assuming that person's values, again, it's like a scalar quantity. Like, how many value points do they have? Well, it must be this person has one and this person has one, so two of them must be two. It's like, no, the value of life could be something very different from an extensive quantity that you measure with a single scale. Um, so it could be like, you know, I mean, I think of it as like a vector space, one dimension per person. And there's no sort of quantitative way to crunch these different dimensions to flatten them into one single metric of goodness points. Um, so yeah, I mean, I basically think that they're thinking too linearly. And then once you allow for the vector space model, uh, you see that there's just no. I mean, you can have a view like this. What it's good to save as many people as you can. Uh, or more accurately, it's good to save the biggest maximal group you can, right? So maximal meaning if you save only one of the Smiths, you could have saved that person and another. But if you save only Jones, there's no extra person you could have saved. There's no way to add more people to the group without taking someone out. So that's not counting in the way of, how many goodness points there are, but it's not psychotic. You're still trying to save lives. It just treats lives as having a less easily quantified value.
Okay. Okay, yeah. Have you seen like Zach Barnett's paper? I think
Yeah,
that
yeah, yeah. No, um, I take him to task. I mean, this is where one issue Zach and I disagree on. I love Zach and Zach's work so much, but so Zach, I'll hit you with this principle. Zach has this really interesting principle, which I call outcome anonymity, and Johann uses, and a bunch of other people use. Cam uses it. I think it's basically the principle that's at work in that argument I gave earlier about tie breaking. Outcome anonymity says if you've got two outcomes and all you're doing is switching who is at which welfare level, then they must be equally good, right? Because if you're just switching who dies, Smith or Jones, and you think, oh my God, Jones dies? Okay, now I'm against it. Well, clearly you're just like a Jones fan, right? So the thought is if you're nobody's fan, if you're treating everybody equally, treating everybody impartially, you can't say it's anything other than equally good to switch who's at which welfare level and leave the rest stable. Okay. Uh, Zach uses this argument like this. So imagine you've got like, you know, uh, 999 people on the utility steps, right? So Person one is on step one, person two on step two, person 999 on step 999, and your welfare level is just what step you're on. Make sense? Okay. Now let's imagine we rotate just a little bit. So person one goes up to person two goes up to three, and so on. And then person 999 drops all the way down to one. So they go from living it up, having amazing pleasure, to utter deprivation, just barely worth living. Now, someone like Scanlon, who I mean, this looks an awful lot like the transmitter room case, where you get shocked in order to give a bunch of people the pleasure of watching the World Cup for a few minutes, right? Because one person plummets and everyone else just barely ascends. Uh, but notice that outcome anonymity says that must be equally good as doing nothing, right? Because all you've done is change who's at which welfare level. You haven't boosted the overall levels or anything, or increased the amount of welfare, or increased the average, or anything like that. So Zach says this is a big problem for contractualism, basically. But I think, you know, uh, it shows that contractualists don't just care about, um, the distribution of welfare. They care about something like who's got the biggest complaint, and the guy who's at risk of plummeting has a bigger complaint than the people who are at risk of not getting to ascend a little bit. But I don't think that the contractualist is treating the plummeter as more important. They're just treating plummeting as more important than a bunch of tiny ascents, right? So while I think Zach's argument is revealing of something, I don't think it's revealing of a kind of partiality on behalf of the contractualist. And so what does this mean? It means that there's probably not some neutral principle like be impartial, or outcome anonymity, to put it, in a bow tie. There's probably not any neutral principle that tells us whether we should aggregate. We're just like totally stuck. And this is fundamental too. It's before we get to deontology. So I just think we are like, whether to aggregate might be the question of like, is pain bad? Like there's just no argument you could possibly give that's convincing to someone who's already got their own answer. Like I'm not like, if you're in pain and I'm like, well, hang on, did you know premise one that, then premise two, therefore it's actually good that you're in pain. You'd be like, leave me alone. Like, you know, and that's how the aggregationists feel when I talk to them. They're like, leave me alone.
Yeah, yeah. Um, yeah. So, the one of the things about intuitions, like I am an intuitionist, right? So I do consider um intuitions, deontological intuitions, Um, so yeah, but it's like to me, it's like when I think about those deontological intuitions, right? And so like footbridge, consider the footbridge craze of pushing the person to death. And Neil in his paper, I think it's similar to like I think what Matthew, I don't know if you know Matthew Edelstein. Um, okay, you probably don't know. He's okay. He's not right now a PhD academic philosopher. He's right now an undergrad. But Neil, in his paper, talked about how if you were like behind this veil of ignorance, I guess, right? You did not know who you are, right? Whether you are on the track or whether you are the person on the bridge, right? Um, so if you push, right, like if you hope that someone pushes the person, right, on the footbridge, right, you will have 5/6 chance of survival, right? You're going to like 83% chance of survival. And if you hope that the person is not pushed, you have 1/6 chance of survival. So right, so I guess just 17%, right? And Yeah, behind the veil of ignorance, things seem to change, I guess. My intuitions just flip, right? Like even when I was like a deontologist, I did think that during the footbridge case, you should not push, right? I did think that way, right? But then when the scenario is like presented that way, right, my intuitions did flip, right? Like immediately they did flip, right? Like, yeah, man, that seems like an important thing, right? And so, by the way, I also like thought about like lexical thresholds, with respect to like um, um, suffering and like death. Like, I think lexical thresholds are just like, okay, so you believe at a certain point, uh, certain thing becomes infinitely valuable, and you cannot just go beyond that, right? So maybe the right to not be eternally tortured, right? I guess, I guess is is so valuable. I mean, look, man, it's infinity. Okay, infinity kind of messes things up. I'm not going to talk about right to not be eternally tortured. It's a bit too much. But
It's a good right to have.
yeah, yeah, it's a good right to have. But let's consider this, right? So, like, if assume that, okay, consider this case. So every 1 million years, a person who is extremely happy is going to suffer a very small itch, right? It will go away after like just a few seconds of scratching or something, right? Every few million years, that's going to happen. But the life of the person is very happy, right? Now, given that the itch is in like every few million years, technically, if you just add up all the pain, it's infinite pain, right? And you can prevent that infinite pain if you kill a random guy in heaven, right? So, um, so it's like, I mean, I think a utilitarian or a consequentialist, I guess, I guess they might have to bite the bullet that, yeah, to prevent that I mean, I guess again, but again, you have to compare like the trade-offs, right? With that
Yeah.
person who like died. Like, what if the person who died, if he lived like a very so happy life that that pain was like, I guess, worth it. So like the pleasure was being compounded, I
Yeah.
guess.
So
Yeah,
this raises a really deep question about
yeah,
how to aggregate. Do you
yeah,
look
yeah.
at lives first and see like, oh, how good is each life going to be? Or do you look at sort of times, right? And try to maximize the amount of pleasure or pain within a certain time. Because, I mean, just to, to put the question very simply in this case, if you've got someone with in an infinitely blissful life, so every day they have 100 pleasure, and then you just pollute each day with zero point zero 0.01 pain, well, that's an infinite amount of pain. However, what's the total amount of pleasure in the life? Well, it seems like the total amount of pleasure is still positive infinity, right? So, I mean, that just kind of shows you that there's some really funny stuff going on with aggregation. I mean, to put it another way, like, but on the other hand, right, the way you put it, like, if you just look at the size of the pain in itself and you say, how bad is it that we added this pain? Well, it's infinitely bad. Then it seems like, well, it'd be way better if we just imposed a finite burden on some of these people. So you torture them for a year or something. So if you torture a finite being for a year, that seems way better than imposing an infinite cost on somebody else. But hang on, the person who just paid the infinite cost, their life is no worse in terms of total pleasure. And the person who just paid the finite cost, their life is like way worse, so much worse. Like as bad as most bad lives in the world. Um, so so I've come around to being like a big person first thinker. I think going times first is really bad. Do you want to hear the case that convinced me? Okay, I think you'll like this one. So I got it from Zach Barnett. My understanding is that it's John Broome is the one who popularized this, and it's based on a case called The Sphere of Suffering by James Cain. Okay, so here's the two afterlives from John Broome. Afterlife one, uh, you're deciding people's fate in the afterlife, and there's infinitely many of them, persons one, two, three, and so on. And in afterlife one, they all start off in heaven. Hooray! However, on day N, person N goes down to hell where they stay forever. Right? So think about it. On day one, person one goes down, person two goes down, and so on. Now, afterlife two is the opposite. Everybody starts off in hell. And on day N, person N ascends to heaven where they stay forever. So the question, which afterlife is better? There's an extremely powerful argument for going for afterlife one, because if everyone starts off in heaven, every day there's infinite pleasure and only finite pain. Let's suppose that a day in heaven is finitely good and a day in hell is finitely bad, right? So day by day, afterlife one is just amazing. And day by day, afterlife two is awful. It's infinite badness every day and only finite goodness. Does that make sense? Yeah, so it seems like a bulletproof argument. Um, on the other hand, look at it person by person. Afterlife two, each person thinks, oh God, I have N days in hell, but then infinite days in heaven to look forward to, right? So, person by person, it's infinitely good to, to go with the second afterlife because each person's life is infinitely good. So, but by contrast, uh, if they start off in heaven, like in afterlife one, their lives are infinitely bad because they're going to spend most of eternity in hell. So this is a case where it's like incredibly clear that if you think about ethics person first as opposed to amounts of and times first, you get a very different picture of how things work. Of course, infinities are weird, as my friend Brian Hedden likes to say. But like, I think this case is super revealing. Like, if you had to pick, do you know which afterlife you would go for, one or two? Putting you on the
You
spot.
know, like I would say like sometimes I guess I'm still a consequentialist by the way, but yeah, so my
Some of my best friends are consequentialists. Yeah,
yeah,
no hate from me.
so
Don't
I would
worry.
have to go with whatever the consequentialists would, would say, I guess. So
So wait, this is important. This is really important. Um, in a way, one thing I'm trying to get across is that aggregation is not a problem that you solve by going consequentialist. Even if you're a
yeah, yeah,
consequentialist,
yeah, of course,
you
of
have to
course.
decide whether to aggregate and how, right? So like some consequentialists think that they believe in this principle called the Pareto principle.
Yeah.
So if A is better for everyone, then A must be better overall. And the second afterlife, where each person spends only finitely many days in hell, is better for everyone. So the Pareto principle says go with that. But then some consequentialists go with like time-based principles, where like, look, if every single day has more pleasure in it, then this outcome must be better. But then you have to go with the other afterlife, where every day you got infinitely many people in hell and only finitely many in heaven. So it's like for there's a question if you're a consequentialist, like what do you care more about is like the location of goodness, days or people?
Yeah, so have you like heard of Hayden Wilkinson? Um
I actually met him what last week in Oxford. Yeah,
yeah, so in
really
Infinite
smart guy.
Ethics, like yeah, he's extremely smart, right? And he does seem to deal with infinite ethics a lot, aggregation. Oliver Thornley also deals with that stuff. So um, you know, when I think about like this like deontology versus consequentialism and like as you are saying, right, like aggregation, there is like a in-house debate between consequentialists. It's so hard to, sometimes pronounce these
I know, I know.
words,
Derek
So,
Parfit apparently had a bunch of like shortcuts in Microsoft Word so that he wouldn't have to write out consequentialist and like principles no one could reasonably reject. And he told us about this. And so for a long time in grad school, I had shortcuts for writing consequentialism and consequentialist and deontologist. Um, but
yeah.
then I got too lazy to use the shortcuts. I don't know what that says about me.
Yeah, yeah. So, so the so I guess like what do you think Richard E. Chapel would say when you give him these two cases, right, about afterlife? What do you think he would say? What would he choose?
That's a really good question. I mean, I actually think, I don't think Richard is so committed to the Pareto principle, the person first thinking. Because in value receptacles, he suggests that you could think that what really matters are sort of like pleasure tokens, right? So particular instances of pleasure, not just, you know, how's Rajat doing over time, but like, oh, there's a pleasure. Where is it? Oh, it happens to be in Rajat.
Yeah,
Uh, and then there's
exactly.
another one. Oh, it happens to be within that same person, Rajat. The next moment. So I think given that given some of his remarks in value receptacles about token pleasures, I would imagine he's actually a bit uncommitted. But I'll have to ask him. Whereas I think Zach and I are both at least I'm super hardcore Pareto principle type of philosopher. Um, the people that are actually so this raises a nice question like who goes days first? Who cares about the space-time distribution more than person by person? And I think it's often people that are a little skeptical of personal, like the distinction between persons as being morally significant, right? People have a kind of what Parfit would call like an impersonal view of ethics. Um, it's like, I mean, with Parfit's, I mean, it's a little bit unclear what exactly this means, but he
Yeah,
seemed to think it meant something like uh, there are there are mental states that have a kind of reality prior to that of the person that has those states. And once you start thinking that way, it's not that hard to think, well, the person is sort of a conventional, arbitrary way of clustering together these really things that fundamentally matter, the experiences, the mental states. Um, and that suggests like, well, maybe space and time are important categories, but which person are the states in? Not so important. Um, but even with Parfit, it's a little hard for me to know for sure. I mean, Parfit says all this persony stuff
yeah,
later in his career. I mean, even in Reasons in Persons, it's not as like anti-person as you might think. But like, um, in his response to Torek, Torek argues against aggregation and should the numbers count.
mm,
Parfit, Parfit's first objection is, well, wait a minute, don't we all believe in agent relativity? So I'm allowed to treat my welfare as more important than yours, and my cat is more important than yours. And so, I think he says loved ones, not cat, but you know, but the point is like the agent is a person, and then later and on, what matters, many years later, 40 years later, um, he says all this stuff about personal reasons to take care of yourself and your family, and
yeah,
um, even like Kantian contractualism is sort of about what each person can rationally will, and his kind of uh, his version of contractualism. So it's like I there's not all that many people that really go hardcore aggregate by space time. It tends to be the impersonal people, and who's impersonal is not that easy to say. Everybody feels the draw of persons. Like so much of ethics seems to be about persons. Like promises, consent, anything that sort of has to do with commitments over time. Um, you know, our own fear of death. Like so much of this stuff is just unintelligible if you don't think that persons matter.
yeah, yeah, exactly, right. And this thing, this thing has started bothering me like when I was a classical, I guess it always bothered me by the way, right? Like this like I was a classical utilitarian, so I would, and not like Richard Yates Chapel, by the way. So I mean, sorry, Richard Yates
You're
Chapel
fine. You're fine. I know what you mean. I know what
like
you mean.
is already is like in his paper value receptacles, he's like token pluralistic utilitarian, right? So I was more like Neil Sinha Babu would say, like pleasure fundamentalist, just increase pleasure. Persons don't matter, just impersonally increase pleasure. Doesn't matter. Persons don't matter, right? Like really, just totally impersonal, right? But then the things that started bothering me, I guess, was like, I guess his epistemology kind of was like satisficing, right? Like, do you like, have you heard of like satisficing thresholds and like stuff like that, right? So, and I believe in God, by the way, and stuff like, okay, what kind of worlds should God create? Given like he's perfect, right? Absolutely perfect. He has like infinite power and stuff like that, right? So, so what would be the minimal decent world from God's perspective, right? So things like satisficing thresholds, like given that Neil is not like an intuitionist, right? So I don't know how do you fit in satisficing threshold a kind of in I guess intuitive way, right? So these things kind of started bothering me, and I thought, okay, if I believe in satisficing thresholds, if I believe in also another thing started bothering me was like I've had a chat with my friend Joe Schmid, like on Facebook, private chat. Um, and we were talking like, how do you think about like absolute perfection of God, right? So if I believe that God is absolutely perfect in every way, then here's the thing, right? That should mean that if God sees someone suffering, right, then God is not feeling like utility monster level pleasure, right? God should be a being who who, who feels pleasure when he sees the pleasure of others, right? So it's like when he creates happy life, God should feel pleasure, right? God should be like in this very aligned, very harmonious. And along with that, God should not feel infinite pain when someone is in pain, right? So, like obviously, but I think he should feel a lot of pleasure. Again, I don't mean to say like infinite because it's weird. What would it mean to say like someone feels infinite pleasure at a moment, right? It's strange thing, but let's just think that he feels large amount of pleasure when he creates a happy life, right? A person who is happy, who's going to have wonderful infinite life, right? Um, but he feels when that person suffers somewhat, he does feel somewhat pain, right? It's his compassion, right? Um, that is like neoclassical theism, by the way, which like the classical theists believe like God is like always happy at no matter what happens. God is always happy. But classical theism is false. I mean, I do not believe that stuff. So I was thinking like, okay, so if I believe in this stuff, right? But if there is a utility monster scenario, right? Consequences, if the consequences, or you could say the value in the world is the only thing that matters, just the value, right? Utility monster God is increasing value. So why like how do you build perfection of God, right? If just thinking in terms of just like total value, right? So it's like that's the thing that kind of opened me toward, I guess, more bleeding heart consequentialism. I think bleeding heart consequentialism is more closer to, I think, your view, moderate deontology. That's what I call your view, you know. So like what do you think about like how this kind of a debate about not just the evaluating perfection, I guess, based on just value out there in the world. but also like thinking about how should a being behave or also be, right? Like what kind of being should there be, right? Like what kind of being should you prefer? So yeah,
I mean, that's an interesting question because what kind of being I'd like there to be versus what kind of being I think is perfect. For me,
yeah.
these come apart.
Oh,
Um, you know, because I don't think that all value is the value of a good consequence that we want to bring about. Like, I think it's very good to have true beliefs. Um, but it's not like I think the goal is to create the outcome of there being true beliefs. Otherwise, I would think, oh, given that Rajat believes all this false stuff, I'm picking on you for a moment, but if you believed all this false stuff, then I think, okay, well, there's two things I could do to achieve the good outcome of true belief. Either I tell Raja, oh no, actually the Earth is round, or I go out there like, hang on, everybody, I'd like to. Well, we need an excavation crew. We need to change the shape of the Earth. I mean, it's a toy example, but the point is, I think, really deep, which is that there's a kind of backwards lookingness to the value of some things, like true belief, but also fitting emotion, right? Also virtue, So I think that, you know, um, what's good about true belief is that it fits the evidence in the world. What's good about, I mean, uh, you know, recognizing achievement, is that it befits the achievement and so on. And I think of the goodness of you, a person, is similarly not a forwards looking thing. Like when I just think Rajat's good, I don't think it's good that he's there, right? I think that you've got, it's not, there's a difference between saying you're good and it's good that your life is going. That's the point. And similarly with the belief, if all there was to good belief is it's good that there's a true belief going on over here, then I would be just as inclined to change the world to make your beliefs true as vice versa. So, I mean, that's one thing I wanted to mention. So, in other words, there's a question of like, what kind of God would I like there to be versus what kind of God would I think is perfect or morally perfect as a being? The kind of God I'd like there to be, um, maybe would be one that would give me a lot of stuff. Be, you know, I'd like to not die. I'd like to have eternal life for me and everybody I love. Um, but is that, I mean, it's a sort of further question whether I think that would a being that gave all of this would be uh, best. Um, can I talk about the threshold a little bit? So, just because I'm a big anti-threshold guy. Like, I think that the threshold is paradoxical. Okay, so imagine that we're talking about a burning building. Okay, there's two kids inside, and if you go in to save some kids, you're going to get burned. But the burns are just as severe, regardless of whether you save one or two. Just as easy to save both as to save one. And you go in and you think, oh my God, I'm over the threshold, right? You don't have to go save anybody. It's so you're going to burn yourself. But what if you think, well, I'm over the threshold? Okay. And then you just leave one of the kids. Maybe you spit in their direction and then you run out of the building with the other kid under your arm. I think that's like clearly wrong. It's clearly wrong to forsake somebody for no good reason to death. Um, but the threshold just cannot capture this problem of gratuitous harm, as it's sometimes called. So, what's going on? I think rather than a threshold that you have to clear, um, you have to compare each option to the alternatives, right? Because whatever you do, I can ask, well, why didn't you do that instead? And if you've got no good answer, then game over. You did something wrong. So why didn't you save the extra kid? Well, because I came in the building and I saved one. It's like that doesn't answer that question at all, right? That's like saying, you know, why did you steal a cookie from the cookie jar? It's like, well, I could have taken two. It's like, well, you're
yeah.
just, yeah, that's nice that you didn't do something even worse, but I'm asking about something else.
So
So I don't believe in thresholds. I think that I believe in, well, a prerogative, not to burn yourself. Not, but that's a further
Okay,
question.
prerogative, right? So imagine God, right? Just imagine a being who's absolutely perfect, has infinite power. Um, he can create like a world with 1 billion people who are very happy who are in heaven, and he can also create a world with like trillion people who are happy who are in heaven. Great. He can do better and better and better, right? Always. So, like, if he can always do better, he can always add good in the world, right? Um,
Ah, good, good, good. Then the principle I just gave breaks down.
that's
Well, I
the
mean,
thing.
well, arguably it does, right? Because
Yeah,
suppose I create a Googleplex to the Googleplex number of incredibly happy people. Someone could say, well, why didn't you create an extra happy person? Or why didn't you create double the number of happy people? Or so and so on. And the answer can't be, well, hey, at least I didn't create zero happy people. Because it's like, well, that seems like just saying, well, at least I didn't steal two cookies from the jar. It's like you can't justify choosing one mediocre option over a good one by pointing out that there's an even worse one.
yeah, yeah,
Yeah, I call that the
yeah. I
second
get it.
cookie fallacy. Um, but what could God say for himself or herself in the case of creating the Googleplex to the Googleplex happy lives? I think it's something like, well, look, there's no way I
Yeah,
could have avoided the complaint that you've given me.
yeah,
And
exactly.
sort of ought implies can, right? So that's different from saying, well, at least I didn't do something worse. It's saying what you're asking of me, when you think about it, is to create the most people possible.
Yeah,
And there's just no such thing.
yeah. There's no limit, right? You can always create more and more people, right? So this is why, like, I do you know Chris Tucker.
Oh
Um,
yeah, 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 yeah.
yeah, he has a paper called I think it is titled Divine Satisficing. I think something like that.
Oh, I actually haven't read this.
Yeah, and I think he basically proposes that there is a satisficing level that God can have. So God can give create a lot of sentient beings and give them fully good life, right? That should be like a kind of minimal decency bar, right? Satisficing bar. He must at least satisfy that, right? Rather than God going like just being alone and then creates a fish that lives for 5 seconds and is happy but then dies, and then 10 million years later creates another fish that lives for like 3 seconds and then dies. I mean, it's like but God is saying, well, at least I give it a life for like if 5 seconds, I mean.
Right.
So
I mean, there's a question of whether this is just a difference in degree or a difference in kind,
yeah,
right? And what you really need to say it's okay that God did only this uh, is to say um, this is yeah. Uh, this is better than the fish, and also there's nothing analogously better that God could have done that you could reasonably expect God to do instead, right? Because there's a worry that if you say, well, what you need to do is meet um, some qualitative threat. It has to be a very good life, not just like the good life of the 5 second fish. You don't want there to be an analogous complaint. Well, why don't you just create a very, very good life, of superhumans,
yeah,
living for 500 years,
yeah,
you know, beings that would look on us and our lives like we look on the fish, right? So I think for Chris's argument to work, there has to be something quite special about what we've got. And
yeah,
you can make the case, right? Self-awareness, consciousness. We live long enough to get to know one another, live in community. Um, we can do philosophy. We can create great civilizations, and we can create now artificial beings that are about to get a lot smarter than ourselves.
yeah.
You know, so that those seem like qualitative differences between us and the fish.
Hmm.
Um, and an interesting hypothesis. There's no further big qualitative shift.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it's more like God saying like if I God was alone and God created someone who lives for like five, let's just say the creed lives, God creates a kid, a child, a 12-year-old child, right? Specifically, right? He lives for 5 seconds and then happily and then dies. And God says, well, at least I did better than if I was alone. So we
Right,
don't
right.
want that. We
Yeah, yeah.
don't,
It has to be something like, look, um, at least I did better than that is clearly not enough.
yeah,
Right.
it's clearly not enough,
Yeah, yeah.
right?
But what you need is something like, you couldn't have expected me to get out of this complaint that you're pressing.
Yeah,
Right. So if the complaint is do better, it's like, look, I could always have done better.
yeah,
There's no way to get out of that complaint. But if the
right.
complaint is, well, at least create beings with free will. Well, hang on. Well, I did that. Right. So there's no, it's not like the complaint was create more beings with free will. You can always do more,
Do more,
but
yes.
create some with free will. That's an actual threshold that can be hit once and for all.
Yes.
No further complaint.
Yeah.
So there's a question of whether humanity, as it is and will be, is one of those thresholds. Like create some beings with XYZ, um, and then I'll be happy. Then I'll be satisfied that you really are a perfect being, um, or at least I won't give up on the idea that you are.
I guess
Um,
one thing we can also add to a perfect being is that he would not, I guess the basic thing would be he would not stop creating, I guess, right? Like it's like you could say that a perfect being is someone who is, of course, always, yeah, of course, you can always demand that he create more than what he's creating, but he's always creating at a certain level or certain amount of times, like every second or something, right? And it is intuitive, I guess. Now, of course, pick any number, it would always seem arbitrary, right? Five, why five? Why not 10? Right? But um, but there has to be, right? Because I mean, if there is no number, um, you like we don't need to say that like given that you will always you someone can always raise the complaint why didn't you do better, why didn't you create 100, um but of course God cannot say, well, at least I did not, at least I created some, right?
yeah.
So there has to be a number, right, that seems
Well,
satisfiable.
there's another possibility, which is that the idea of a perfect being, against whom we can raise no valid complaints makes no sense. It's possible that it's just a paradox. Um,
Absolute
Because,
perfection
if
is a
we say
paradox.
God is like really good, well, it's consistent with a being being really good that they create a really good world. Doesn't have to be perfect.
Yeah,
Um, so how to put this? Like, I mean, this gets back to the idea of paradoxes that I sort of started with.
yeah.
You know, so many incredibly basic ideas are paradoxical. Like the idea of truth is very dangerously close to paradox, right? Everything's either true, false, or no truth value. So this sentence is not true. Okay.
Yeah.
Well, it can't be true. It also can't be false because then it would be true. It can't even be neither true nor false because then it would be true. Um, so
Yeah.
it's yeah. So it's called the strengthened liar. So truth is like notoriously in danger of being paradoxical. Uh, the idea of a set. Okay, this is like the most, in a way, the most basic mental idea of just collecting several things, right? Think about the set of people or the set of even numbers or what have you. It seems like for any property things have or don't have, you can just think about those things, then collect them into a set, right? Uh, so this is something called naive comp.
Hello, Dan. You are.
It's called
Oh,
naive for so think about the things, think about the sets that are. Oh, Sorry,
You
internet
were,
connection unstable for a moment.
yeah, your connection was stable. You were just stuck, frozen. Um,
Sorry about that.
yeah,
Can I? I'll just can I pick up with sets really quick?
yeah, sets.
Okay, so
Go ahead.
just as the idea of truth is in danger of being paradoxical, so is the idea of a set, right? So the idea seems like I can collect the persons, think of them as a set, the even numbers, think of them as a set. It seems like for any property, I could just think of the things that have it and collect them in my mind into a set. But Bertrand Russell points out you can't do this. I think of the sets that don't, uh, the set of members. Sorry. The set of sets that don't contain themselves. So there's a property not containing yourself. But if you have a set of those sets, it's inconsistent, right? Because um, if something is in the set, well, it must not contain itself. But what about the set itself?
Yeah,
Well, if it's it's in itself if it's not, because if it's not in itself, then it must be, and if it is, then it must not be. Um, so like just the idea of a set, as we naively thought of it, contained paradoxes. The naive idea of truth contained paradoxes. So maybe the naive idea of perfection also
yeah.
contains a
Also
paradox.
contains, yeah, same, yeah. Um, of course, of course. So, I guess one thing that I wanted to talk with you about, perhaps it's not, I don't, I think it's somewhat in your field, um, normative ethics, but it's also somewhat in metaphysics, or theology, I guess. So, like the belief about eternal hell, right? Like
Yeah.
some
Used to keep
Christian,
me up at night a lot.
yeah, some Christians, some Muslims believe that, right? Eternal hell. Some of them, and eternal hell can have like two interpretations. One is that eternal torture, another is eternal death, right? Like in the good place, God just allows some people to be killed or like kill themselves or something, or or God kills people because of as a punishment, right? From your perspective as a deontologist, should a perfect being allow eternal hell, right?
It's a really good question. I would say no. I mean, it seems like disproportionate punishment to me, basically. I think to go to hell forever, you'd have
Yeah.
to be doing infinitely bad things
Yeah.
with perfect culpability, or at least with very high culpability. Um, and I don't think humans meet those conditions. I think a lot of people are very culpable for certain finite harms, but I mean, you know, infinite hell is really the nuclear option. And this was, I think, one of the things that personally pushed me away from religion when I was younger,
Oh,
is the doctrine of heaven and hell.
yeah. I also don't believe those doctrines. Eternal hell. I mean, I do believe in heaven, right? Because I think I think I believe everybody, all sentient beings, should be happy, right? Deserve fully good life. As Chris Tucker would say. I personally believe
Do you
that.
think that people ever should feel bad?
Um,
I mean, obviously, right, maybe you should feel bad for the sake of some later greater good. Like,
yeah.
it's good that you feel pain when you touch the stove so that you know not to leave your hand on it. But I
Yeah,
mean, like, is it ever intrinsically good for people to feel bad?
I think if someone is suffering when you feel bad, I think that seems fitting, right? That seems
Yeah,
fitting.
yeah, agreed.
When someone is suffering, you feel bad. That seems like a fitting attitude. I consider that to be a great making property, right? You should feel, again, you should not feel exactly as that person who is suffering, right?
Right.
But you should feel like basically empathy, right? Compassion. They are good things. I believe that they are good things, intrinsically good even. So yeah. But so what the thing is this, right? there are like issues with like eternal hell. One of the funny issues I get into is like if someone believes that animals, non-human animals go to heaven, and I bring in this example, I think I'm like so bonobos are less violent than chimpanzees, by the way. They are much less violent, but they also have sex a lot with each other, or and they masturbate a lot. So a bonobo, if you believe that non-human animals go to heaven. So a bonobo who in the zoo had a pretty fantastic chill life in a good zoo, like let's assume it's like in the Norway or Denmark zoo, like very high human development index and like animal development index, I guess. Um, Fantastic life, chilled out, masturbated a lot, and that bonobo is in heaven. But then a human being is in eternal hell, right? And now, of course, the people who believe in eternal hell give this view that when you offend a being with infinite dignity, that is God, you accrue infinite guilt. So you deserve infinite suffering. What do you think about that? I guess that kind of, you know,
Um,
defense of eternal hell.
yeah, conditional on there being a perfect God and the number one and most important thing in the world being showing due respect. I can see why you would think that's a big deal to disrespect the perfect God.
Yeah,
Uh, as for the bonobos, I mean, it does seem like a cosmic kind of injustice that maybe they would get a nicer afterlife than a naughty human being would. But I sort of get it. I mean,
yeah,
actually, this goes back to the question whether there's something like qualitatively different about what's good in human life. I can think about bonobos and think their deaths are, although sad, um, fine. Like I don't think it's a crime against nature that uh, bonobos have finite lives. I don't think it's so sad when trees die out or when the deer population goes up and down according with predators and so on. To me, like these natural things, it's fine that they're so bounded. But there's something like I don't know how to put it, fundamentally unfair about human death to me. Uh, I don't have any sophisticated reason why, but this is just how emotionally it strikes me. Um, that it just seems like a joke that we die.
yeah,
Um, I was once talking to, this is a random story, but I was once talking to Mark Johnston, uh, at, who was giving a talk at MIT when I was a grad student.
yeah,
And, I think I told him I was going to move to Australia for my first job. And he instantly warmed up to me after that. And we were a few drinks in, and at one point, towards the end of the night, he said, MIT ethics is bullshit. It's all just trolley problems you know, uh, and I think he was thinking of kind of old school MIT ethics, like that's where Judy Thompson worked. But it was a little funny because now at that time it was all like Mark Johnston students that were the ethicists. Like,
yeah,
but but then Mark said something that stuck with me for my like entire life since then, which is was why is it bullshit? He said because it's not talking about the fundamental unfairness of existence, and that seemed like both the kind of petulant thing to think about reality, like is this it? Like I expect more out of my existence than this cosmic offering. It's a
yeah,
sort of like unfair. Has to me a feeling of like I'd like to speak to the manager of the universe, please, and complain. Uh,
yeah,
but also like this, it just seems. I think he's right. He might be right. Like I don't know what you can possibly say about this. Um, I hope I could find things to say about this, but it does seem to me unfair or ill-fitting or unjust or a travesty that human beings get to understand our lives and want to live so badly,
and they die.
and we die.
It's
There's
unloving
nothing we can
too.
do about it.
It's uncompassionate, right? It's unloving or uncompassionate, I would also say, right? I think that's really important. So, um, like, I think you said a little bit about that infinite dignity thing. Um, you said like if someone like believes in like such a thing like infinite disrespect and they take it really seriously. So, uh, why do you not find that plausible? That an infinite being with infinite dignity, um, and disrespecting.
Yeah, I mean, to me, it feels like personification. Um, it's like taking the village chief and blowing him up to a cosmic scale. And to me, it seems like some like farcical. Like if there really is such a great being, I don't think they'd have an ego. I don't think that they would commit. They'd care about obedience to themselves so much. Um, and I think one reason I'm confident saying this is that I suppose I just have this picture of morality, where what really matters is not obedience to the great beings as such. Where I think it's
Yeah.
important that people have a certain amount of control over their own lives, their own bodies. I think it's important people be spared suffering and deprivation and loneliness, if possible. And so I think what's going on Earth is very important. And I just don't see the idea of like tribute to the great chief in the sky is so important. And I don't mean to be disrespectful. I
It's
think that
totally
people.
fine. I mean, it's totally fine. Yeah.
I mean, well, the thing is, like, I definitely, everybody has, I shouldn't say everybody, but I think a lot of people have spiritual experiences where they feel
Yeah.
that there's something more to the universe and so on.
Yeah.
And the idea of feeling awe and reverence towards a being or towards something about reality, I totally get. But the idea that that being is very touchy and and really is concerned
Yeah. I mean,
about.
they would say it's not touchy. It's that they deserve it because it's just like a moral fact that if you offend a being with infinite dignity, you deserve it. You deserve
I
infinite
see. Yeah,
suffering.
yeah.
And
I
the
mean,
infinite being does not want that, but it demands of justice.
No, no, that's true. That's true. I'm being playing a little fast and loose here. Let
Yeah.
me be fair. Yeah. So the thought is you're failing to give just desserts. Um,
Yeah.
and I mean, I guess you could also put it in terms of gratitude, right? You've been given this incredibly valuable, maybe infinitely valuable gift of free will and of existence. So the idea goes. And so, you're just an ingrate if you turn around and you turn your back on your heavenly Father. Um, that I understand. Um, I suppose a lot of it. I mean, so I'll quibble with some of the internal logic
Yeah.
of that divine morality, but more than anything, I think I'm just not so. I just look at the world seems like a bit of a mess to
Yeah.
me,
Right.
and our existence seems to be somewhat of an accident. But I will say that the fine tuning argument is a very important caveat to this, and I think it's like you know um, intellectually very serious whether the fine tuning argument works. Because the idea being that there's certain parameters in physical theories, and if they'd been wiggled a little bit, then the conditions for life would have not existed,
Yeah.
which suggests that maybe the being has their sort of finger on the dial, right? Um, the slider, if you will. And I think that argument is sort of the modern version of the argument from design that
Yeah. Yeah. Um,
human organisms, like how could they possibly have come about? So there must have been some designer. Uh, but look, I'm one of the people. I actually think the argument from design at the time was a
yeah.
pretty
I mean,
rationally compelling argument.
then we
It's
moved away
only
from,
after
uh,
someone thought of evolution by natural selection that there was any convincing reply to that argument.
yeah. I mean, then we moved away from, we moved away from eternal hell to argument from, we moved to argument from fine tuning. Um, I guess. my question was just why do you not find it plausible, I guess, the disrespectful that kind of view of eternal, like infinite being deserves infinite respect. Do you just like, is it just basic intuition that,
Well, I don't, I think disrespect can be ill-fitting, but it's a weird thing to punish for. I'll put it that way, right?
okay,
Like, I think it's very fitting to admire The Godfather, the movie. Like, it's
yeah,
a great movie. Um, if you didn't like the movie, I would think, wow, that's messed up. Or if you didn't feel gratitude towards your parents,
yeah,
if they suppose your parents raised you very well, blah blah blah. I think like, well, that's so ungrateful. But it's a very weird thing to punish for. Like
yeah,
punishments tend to be for like transgressions, like murder. But the idea of having some kind of like right to tribute and respect and gratitude doesn't seem like the right way to think about it to me. So
yeah,
that's why I'm glad you pressed me on this because
yeah,
it took me a while to
yeah,
figure it
I
out.
wanted
But
to do
that's
that
why it feels wrong to me.
because that's what I'm into, right? Like I'm into theology and stuff like that. That's why I did that. I'm like I'm sorry to interrupt, but like I had to do that because um
I'm glad you did.
yeah, yeah. So yeah, I think same here, right? Like I just find it so like the world would be a tragedy if there is such a morality. I mean it's like
Yeah,
yeah,
definitely.
it's like yeah, so if someone who is suffering in pain and blasphemes God and he's sent to eternal torture. And not only that, it's like why would God create a situation when he knows that this kind of stuff would happen, right? Like like he would have known that this would happen, right? Like he is like in a playground, if you have a sandbox, you create a situation where there is like some horrifying torture machine and someone gets caught in it um out of their free will, I guess.
Yeah.
So I mean it's
That's the
like
thing. If you believe in some kind of free will,
yeah,
in fact, it doesn't even have to be libertarian free will. But divine foreknowledge is not a total given. Um, this is the last thing I'll mention. Then I should go.
yeah,
But
yeah, yeah, yeah,
you know, one really interesting idea is that of a frustrator, right? So if you know what I believe you're going to do, maybe because I don't have a poker face, then your desire might be to frustrate my beliefs, right? So I think, oh yeah, Rajat's going to have a sandwich for lunch. And then you can see what I think. And you say, no way, I'll have a salad. And if I think, okay, well, Rajat's not going to have a sandwich, then you think, aha, he thinks I'm not going to have a sandwich. I'm going to go have a sandwich. In this condition, it's just literally impossible. It's for me to know what you'll do.
yeah.
But
Okay.
it's not required for that you have some kind of free will that's unconstrained by the laws of physics or something like this, right? All we had to stipulate is that you wanted to frustrate me. So to the extent that we can know God's predictions, it is possible that divine foreknowledge could be uh, prevented, which is a very interesting uh, bit of doctrine. And again, it kind of goes back to this idea that there's paradoxes in all these ideas that for millennia seemed totally
Yeah.
obvious, or
Okay.
at
Okay.
least obviously coherent.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay.
Okay. That makes sense.
Roger, this
I'm
was a
going to
huge pleasure.
stop. I'm going to stop the recording now. It was a fantastic chat. I want you to stick around like just for like few minutes. I want to ask your feedback after I
Sure.
stop the recording.
Great.